realfaith.org.au.
Queen's Park, Toowoomba. It's much like any other park in regional Australia. But this park's a little different. At over 25 hectares, the park, which is adjacent to the Toowoomba CBD, is massive. And every Easter for almost 2 decades, Queen's Park was the epicentre of the Easterfest festival. A festival that was often spread throughout Toowoomba's laneways, churches, cafes and other venues, but whose beating heart was in the green space of the park.
Welcome to Real Faith. Conversations about the impact faith has on our lives and the challenges we go through, helping us today and giving us hope for tomorrow. That's real people, real life and real faith with Eric Scatterbo.
Well, the Easterfest Christian Music Festival grew to become one of Queensland's major events with nearly 40,000 attending at its peak in 2011. But it was forced to finish up just a few years later in 2015. How did it get so big and why did it suddenly disappear? We'll find out about this and more as we chat with Justin Rouillon today. Justin has produced a podcast series called The Rise and Fall of Easterfest, and it's filled with insights into this special event in Australian Christian history. Justin Rouillon, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Eric.
Glad to have you with us. And my first question for you, why was Easterfest such a special thing to you, so much so that you made this podcast?
Yeah, I think looking back on the event, years down the track now, it was such a great time. Obviously, we were all young and it was a great time of our lives, but the festival, more than just a music festival, really was about community. Mm-hmm. And especially in those years before social media and smartphones, it was a way to gather with other like-minded people on a much larger scale. You think you go to church on Sundays and you have your church community. Well, then it was like that, mm-hmm. but on steroids. There was thousands and thousands of people it grew to become, and it was just such a great community. And then you had this kind of melting pot of this great festival with great music. It grew to become an international event, mm-hmm. But people who were in and around Brisbane in the late 90s, early 2000s will know there was a very healthy music scene. You had people like Peter Shirley and Steve Grace operating in more of like a mainstream kind of format, a traditional CCM kind of format. And then you had all
CCM?
Of these... Yeah, I guess more like a contemporary Christian music mm-hmm. Kind of genre. Mm-hmm. And then you had all of these indie bands popping up in the late 90s. You had bands like Rhubarb and Battered Fish and
Battered
Dumpster.
Fish, I love that name.
Yeah, some great names. And then later in the 2000s, bands like Alabaster Box. And so when Easterfest started, it was originally called the Australian Gospel Music Festival, or AGMF. Mm-hmm. And it was just another opportunity for these bands to play. And for many years, there'd been sort of indie events like there was a little festival called Groundswell. Mm-hmm. There were other smaller events that were held in churches called Manifesto. There was a lot of things happening in the youth group kind of space where bands would come in and play. There was a larger event called the Australia Day Music Marathon that featured bands like Jars of Clay. So you'd have like an international band come and play, and then all day local bands would be playing as well. So when the Australian Gospel Music Festival started later to become Easterfest, it was kind of just the cherry on top of what was kind of already happening in the local scene.
Yes, and you even played as a musician in Easterfest.
Yeah, I did. I played in a couple of bands. I spent many years as a muso, working musician. I played in a couple of indie bands called Breathing Autumn, and another one called Newport. Breathing Autumn was assigned to the local Christian record label in Brisbane that was called Tupe Records, and was really a great catalyst, that record label, in growing the Christian music scene in Brisbane at that time.
Okay, so it's quite obvious you have a passion for all this. Everything we're chatting about, the festival, the music, everything. So making this podcast must have been a labor of love.
It was definitely a passion project, that's for sure. I mean, and it was a great way to celebrate what was a really unique and special time, not only in my life, but for literally tens of thousands of people who attended the festival over the years. And, the really interesting thing is looking back, and so much of the festival happened before, smartphones and social media and that kind of thing. So, as I mentioned, it was a really great community atmosphere, but everyone was just kind of living in the moment. And that was one of the things I'd kind of forgotten about. When I went back to those early years. I'm like, oh, there's not a lot of records of, what actually happened, because it's not like now where people would throw things up on YouTube or up on Facebook or whatever.
Yeah.
It was just such a great community. And that was the word that everyone kind of comes back to when they reflect on the festival. It was just such a great community. And then for the actual event, it was a really accessible way for people to get into the Christian space, maybe if they came from a unchurched background, or, whatever label we want to put onto people, non-Christians. It was a really accessible way for them to become maybe involved in faith or ask questions.
Yeah.
But then for the wider community, it also engaged the wider community in Toowoomba. So you had all of those businesses in Toowoomba that were
we're going to get to that. I'm going to stop right there, because we're going to come back to all the details of what led to Easterfest beginning and the rise and fall and all that. But I want to back up a little bit and find out a little bit about your journey. What led you to become involved in Easterfest and all that, all the different parts of your life that led to you making this series and qualifying you for making it. So let's go all the way back to your childhood. Where did it all begin for Justin Rouillon?
Okay, proud Queenslander, born and bred in Brisbane, although I did spend a number of years in Rockhampton, in central Queensland as a very young child. My dad was a pastor.
Yes, let's talk about your dad, because he was on this program before in the past.
Yeah, Graham, he's well known in the Christian community in Queensland. He was a Baptist pastor for many years. So I spent some years in Rockhampton, central Queensland, and then he got a job in Taree, which is on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. So we spent 5 years in Taree, and then we moved back to Brisbane when I was about 10 or 11. And now the thing with Dad is he's not terribly blessed with musical skills.
Oh, is that right?
That's right.
Even though his son is all into music.
That's right. Not. Well, all of his kids are into music.
Is that right?
We're massive music fans and musicians. My sister's a composer. My brother Trent was a drummer and percussionist. He's now a wedding photographer. So we're all in that creative kind of space. Anyway, but Dad, even though he had not a sort of real musical talent, he loved music, and he loved all different kinds of music. So as kids, we were exposed to all manner of music. From the Beatles, he loved his 60s stuff.
Yeah.
So, I was raised on like the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan. But then Dad was also very heavily into Christian music as well, especially in the 80s. I guess you had all those artists coming out like Amy Grant and Michael W. Smith. And so that was kind of around
Keith
as well.
Green, of course.
Yeah, Keith Green. Yep, we loved Keith Green and all those kind of artists. And I guess as I grew older, I loved, what was happening in the Christian space, but then I also loved what was happening in more of a mainstream space as well. And the interesting thing about Brisbane in the late 90s was a lot of those bands that would go on to play at Easterfest and the Australian Gospel Music Festival would often play shows in churches, but then the next week you might find them playing in a pub or, so.
That's interesting. So were they playing the same Christian songs, or how did they do that?
Absolutely. Yeah, so one week you could find them in the pub playing those same kind of songs, and then the next week you might find them in a youth group or in a church. So a lot of these bands, while they may not have had, say, evangelism in the forefront of their lyrics, they might have been a little bit more
subtle.
That's right. Yeah, they saw their ministries getting into the places where the unchurched people were.
Oh, okay, I got you. Now, for you personally, in your childhood, in addition to loving music, also you really loved nature?
Yeah, I loved getting out into the bush as a kid. Spent a lot of time in nature, especially when we were in Taree. I used to spend a lot of time canoeing, kayaking.
Oh, sounds good.
abseiling, mountain climbing. We did a lot of bushwalking in all weather. I remember, 7 or 8, as a young boy of 7 or 8, hiking through the Barrington Tops in the snow.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it was just a great childhood. And I spent a lot of time in nature and out in the Australian bush. And I guess that's where I kind of saw the fingerprint of God. Spending time in creation and just that was kind of my experience of God, as well as being raised in the church. I just loved that.
And speaking of God, what was your relationship with him? I mean, obviously you said that your dad was a pastor, but did you rebel against that, or did you have faith at an early age?
No, I think I had faith at an early age. And I guess being raised in the church, you've always got that around you. And I did the usual teenage thing where I probably rebelled a little bit. But, it was always kind of there. Even you think you walk away from God, but you don't really.
Oh, yeah, he's always there.
He's kind of always got you.
Yeah.
And, it was really I always just felt like the church was my home, or, that people of faith were my people.
Okay, and then going into your young adult years, we've heard how music was a big part of your life, and then also your faith was growing. What happened next in your life?
Yeah, well, I think, growing up in a family where music was so important, it was only natural that myself and my siblings would learn instruments. And so we were all trained. I ended up being classically trained as a brass player.
As a brass player?
Yeah, I trained as a trumpet player.
Oh, okay.
And thought that I'd be a brass teacher one day, and I ended up sort of giving that away for rock and roll at one point. But yeah, my sister was classically trained. She was a great jazz singer in her younger years, and we ended up playing in a band together for a few years there. And so obviously you end up playing in church as well. So this was in the mid-90s when Hillsong was, Hillsong was really growing, and you had all those great songs by like Jeff Bullock, and I remember when Reuben Morgan came through, and he had some great songs, obviously Darlene Check, and there were all these classic Australian songwriters that had their songs in church, and you would spend time practicing and playing these songs in church, and I guess that had an impact on me as well. But I was also wanting to use my musical talents, I guess, out in what we would say the world. And I ended up playing in a bunch of mainstream kind of bands, and we would play in nightclubs and pubs, and we would tour around. And so I sort of had that on one hand. Saturday night I might be playing in a pub, and then Sunday morning, the next morning, I'd be turning up and playing in church as well. So I guess...
but you're not saying that you had a dual life. You were a Christian.
No, not a dual life.
Places.
No. But it was just one of those things, like some people end up just playing in church their whole life. And I really just wanted to use my musical abilities that I felt like God had given me in a wider scope than just the church.
Our guest today is Justin Rouillon, who's created a podcast series called The Rise and Fall of Easterfest, which is filled with insights into that special event. We've begun by hearing a little bit of Justin's background, and next we're going to hear more of his story and about the beginning of Easterfest. All that and more is coming up when we return right here on Real Faith.
The Word for Today is Australia's most widely read daily devotional, designed to give you practical teaching to keep you focused on your relationship with Jesus. Read it online or subscribe to the free printed edition at thewordfortoday.com.au.
You're listening to Real Faith, conversations with real people about how God works in their lives. If you want to know more about integrating faith into your life, our website is realfaith.org.au. Just go to the website and you'll find helpful articles about the impact faith can have on your life. Once again, that's realfaith.org.au.
Welcome back. I'm Eric Scadabo, and today I'm chatting with Justin Rouillon, who's joining us from the studios of 96.5 FM in Brisbane, where he's the audio production manager. Justin is sharing with us a bit of his life journey and what eventually led him to producing a podcast series called The Rise and Fall of Easterfest. Now here's more of my conversation with Justin. And then when you went to university, what did you study?
Yes, I ended up studying music and
surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise. I did a Bachelor of Arts. I majored in music, but then I also majored in Asian studies.
Interesting. Why?
Well, this was kind of the mid-90s when Australia was very much sort of aligning itself with Asia, and that was kind of a new concept. And so I thought maybe, at one point, I'd go and be like a diplomat or work in the foreign affairs or something like that. But very quickly, the music took over, and by this stage, I'd started playing in some bands. I was playing in some worship bands at church, and the music just really took over, and I forgot about that side of things, really.
Okay. And when did radio come in the picture?
Yeah, for me, radio came into the picture late in my life. I started working in radio at the age of 30.
So well after university.
Well after university, I basically spent my 20s playing in bands and chasing the music. Chasing the music dream.
So that was your dream. You wanted to basically be a rock star.
Yeah, I don't know about a rock star, but I definitely wanted to be a successful musician, whatever that looks like. And I guess for me, success meant you could
make a living.
You could play and be paid, and you didn't have to have a day job.
Yeah. So how close did you get to that?
We kind of got there. I mean, I played in some bands that had some success with Triple J, who was like the national youth broadcaster, and we toured to Sydney and Melbourne, and we were on the way. And then, as bands do, they break up, and you sort of think, well, what's next? And I kind of got burnt out with it. By the time I was 30, you're playing late at night, and I just kind of felt like I'd burnt out, and I'd been studying audio engineering. I was quite interested in recording studios. Having been a musician, I'd spent a lot of time in recording studios and got interested in learning about the equipment and how that side of things worked. And I ended up going back to school at night to learn all about how to be an audio engineer. And from there, I managed to get into radio and landed a job with 96.5 in Brisbane, who is the Christian radio station in Brisbane.
And you've been there since what year?
Since 2008.
Wow. So obviously all these experiences you had, music and audio engineering and all this kind of stuff, overqualified you to make a podcast about the Easterfest history. But how did you get involved in Easterfest in the first place?
Well, my first Easterfest festival was one of the AGMFs, the Australian Gospel Music Festivals, in 2000. So the event started in 1999. I turned up in the year 2000, and at that point, what they were doing was running events all over town. So Sunday afternoon would be music in the park, and Saturday there was a street festival, and they'd have things in churches on Sunday mornings, and they'd have people playing in cafes and laneways, and so that was my first memory of the Australian Gospel Music Festival. I remember the street festival in the main street. They had a stage down one end of the main street and market stalls, and I'd actually gone up with my dad, who was there with Compassion. He got Compassion up and running in Queensland, and because of his musical
what was
love,
his title with Compassion?
He was the Queensland State Manager.
Okay.
And because he'd loved music and he'd seen what Compassion had done in the US with musicians and artists, he'd sort of worked towards a similar thing in Brisbane or in Queensland.
Yeah, so the idea, correct me if I have this wrong, but the idea is you have all these musicians playing all their great music, Christian music, and then they kind of say somewhere in the concert, and by the way, we're sponsored by Compassion, and if you'd like to sponsor a child or
we
something like
support
that.
Support the Ministry of Compassion, and then they might talk about the Ministry of Compassion and why it's important to sponsor kids, that kind of thing, from the stage.
Yeah.
And
so your dad started that.
In Australia, he definitely definitely got that up and running. So when AGMF started, he of course saw the value in having Compassion aligned with AGMF, and so he was a very early, I guess, adopter of the festival as a way to spread the word about Compassion in Queensland. So they're my first memories, and of course I was very heavily involved in the local Christian music scene. And a lot of
playing in all those groups that you were.
I was playing in groups, and I was following a lot of other groups around and going to their shows, and a lot of them were playing up there as well. So that's my first memory. And then gradually over the years, they moved everything into Queen's Park, which is this massive, I think it's a 25-hectare site. It's literally right next to the Toowoomba CBD, great location in town. They moved everything into the park, and that's really when the festival started growing and sort of gaining momentum, and eventually, thousands and thousands of people started attending.
So at this point, I just want to complain. You were kind enough to send me previews of your podcast, and it talked about the interesting way the festival started, and I was just getting into it when it just faded out about 5 minutes into it. That's what a preview is, just to annoy me. But
I'm sorry it annoyed you.
So, that's kind of a way of saying it's fantastic. It's very interesting, well produced. You can tell you're putting all your skills to use in making this, because it's got a little bit of music, and it's got the vibe of the whole history and everything. But then you just gave me a little preview, so that's the problem.
I'm sorry, Derek. I'm sorry, Eric. But yeah, really, one of the things that got the festival really some momentum. You might remember the band Delirious.
Let's go back even further than that. This is the part that really grabbed my attention. The people who started this Christian festival weren't Christians. Tell us about that.
Yeah, a lot of them weren't, which is really interesting.
So how did they? Why would the non-Christians start a Christian festival? You got to answer me that.
Well, so okay, this is what happened. The Toowoomba church community were really heavily invested in a lot of the civic goals of the city. And Toowoomba, I guess, is an interesting study in church unity. And you think about churches, and most churches are focused on their own congregations, and that's great. But what was happening in Toowoomba was that a lot of the churches were working together and really had a vision to grow something in their city. So they got together with a whole bunch of business leaders, the local Chamber of Commerce, the council, the mayor, even the Queensland Police came on board.
Wow.
And they really wanted to create some kind of festival for the city that was positive. And so they thought about it, and they said, well, why don't we do a gospel music festival? Because we've got all the churches involved, why don't we do a gospel music festival? And they kind of looked at Tamworth as a bit of an inspiration. So many people will associate Tamworth with country music.
So that's kind of covered already. They had to do something different.
Yeah, so they didn't want to do country music, but they said, we've got the churches involved. Why don't we do a gospel music festival? So a lot of the people who actually funded the first number of festivals, who put their hands in their pockets and financed it all, were non-Christians, which I think is amazing. And they actually saw the value of having a festival at Easter, which was about Easter and had a gospel message and a positive focus. Well, and they saw the value in that.
And on a practical level, so you're not going to have drugs and alcohol there. You're going to have pretty much well-behaved kids attending.
That's right. And because the police were involved, they always would say the crime rate would go down in Toowoomba over Easter.
Is that right?
Which is actually crazy. You think you're bringing all these people into town, but the crime rate would actually go down over Easter, which is a wild concept.
Okay, well, that was part one of my conversation with Justin Rouillon, who has produced a podcast series called The Rise and Fall of Easterfest, which is filled with interviews and insights into that special Christian music festival. And I'm happy to say that, unlike myself, who only heard a short preview, you can listen to the full podcast series and all the episodes involved. Just look up Easterfest or The Rise and Fall of Easterfest on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Once again, just look up Easterfest or The Rise and Fall of Easterfest. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and we invite you to join us again next time for more of the Easterfest story. That's coming up next time when Justin Rouillon joins us once again. Until then, I'm Eric Scadabo. So long, and God bless.
You've been listening to Real Faith, and if you have any questions or comments, you can send us a message through our website, realfaith.org.au. That's realfaith.org.au.
Real Faith is a production of Vision Christian Media.
This program is a production of Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, see vision.org.au.